When the kitchen smoke turns with the wind. Vivian's funeral ended in a fine gray drizzle, the kind of rain that looked almost like ash. It clung to the old roof tiles, then slid down in pale streaks along the eaves. The house in Jiao Thui, Nam Dinh, seemed suddenly much larger once the wreaths had been carried away. The back kitchen, where Vivian had washed rice and coaxed firewood into flame for decades, had fallen strangely still. There was no clatter of lids, no familiar smell of braised fish sauce mingling with straw smoke. Only the faint, bitter scent of burnt votive paper remained, cold and metallic in the air. Annie stood in the doorway with an old tin box in her arms, the very box she had pulled down from the attic above the kitchen. She was 29, an editor of documentary films in Hanoi, used to cutting a life into scenes and layers of sound. Yet she had never known how to edit a house that had just lost its heart. Her mother, Mai, had spent the whole morning receiving guests in the yard, nodding, thanking people, then turning her face away whenever someone mentioned Vivian. There had been a silence between mother and daughter for more than 10 years, not the kind that followed one violent quarrel and then passed, but the kind that rotted slowly from the inside, like a chopping block that absorbed water and knife marks for so many seasons that one day it gave way under the lightest touch. Growing up, Annie knew only this much. Her mother disliked coming back to the village, Vivian never called first, and every Lunar New Year, gifts moved back and forth as if duty itself had taken physical form. As a child, Annie had lived with her grandmother for several years. Vivian had taught her how to pick greens, light a cooking fire, and split sugar cane. She was not soft, and she rarely embraced anyone, but on the nights Annie burned with fever, it was Vivian who sat awake, changing the cloth on her forehead until dawn. Annie had never understood how one person could be both the shelter of childhood and the cause of a family wound that lasted that long. The paint on the tin box had peeled into ragged islands. Inside lay a brown notebook, a few mother-of-pearl buttons, a tarnished copper bracelet, and a bundle of papers wrapped in oiled cloth. On the cover of the notebook, in a slanted, elegant hand, were 4 words, "When the kitchen smoke turns with the wind." It was not Vivian's handwriting. Vivian wrote in thick, blunt strokes, as if she were cutting marks into paper with a knife. This script belonged to another woman, someone patient and careful. Annie carried the notebook to the front porch. The first pages held old recipes: mixed field green crab soup, dried sweet potatoes steamed with dark sugar, millet porridge with mulberry leaves for a feverish child, a method for fermenting tiny shrimp paste during damp weather. Between the recipes were scattered lines that read like fragments of a diary. When there is smoke rising from a house, people still want to come home. If one day Mai grows up and resents those who came before her, let someone live one season of bitter wind in my place and understand this: some women never learn softness because life never once gave them a soft place to rest.
Annie stopped breathing for a moment. May was her mother's name. She lifted her eyes toward the yard. May sat on a low stool, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold long ago. Her profile in the gray light looked familiar and impossibly distant at once. "Did Grandma write this?" Annie asked. May did not turn around. "No, it was probably Great-Grandma Helen." "Helen?" "Your grandmother's mother." The name was almost never spoken in that house. Sometimes when Vivian lost patience and cursed her own life, she would mutter only one sentence: "My mother had it harder than I ever did." Then she would fall quiet again. By the time evening pressed down, the rain had thickened. The electricity flickered twice, then disappeared entirely. The whole house sank into a blue-black dusk. Annie found a candle and set it on the table beside the notebook. Wind hissed through the back door and bent the flame sideways. She picked up the copper bracelet from the box and rubbed the dust away with the edge of her sleeve. The metal was unnaturally cold, as if it had just been hauled from the bottom of a well. On the final page of the notebook, there was one blurred line. "Whoever comes after me, if you can love them, then love them for me. If the kitchen grows cold, the house will come apart." A bolt of thunder ripped across the sky. Annie flinched, caught her finger on the paper, and a bright bead of blood dropped onto the bracelet. At once, a gust slammed the kitchen door wide open. The candle went out. In that instant of thick darkness, Annie smelled straw smoke rising all around her, heard a child crying close by, and somewhere, in the wind, a desperate voice called, "Mother, please open the door!" Then the world tipped. When she opened her eyes, the ceiling was lower and thatched with straw. Thin skeins of smoke curled around blackened beams overhead. The room no longer smelled like damp concrete and grief in 2026. It smelled of cooking ash, rain-soaked earth, hand-rolled tobacco, and a life worn into the floor. Her head throbbed. Outside, rain beat against the roof in a heavier, older rhythm. There were hurried voices in the yard, the sharp cry of a child, and a breathless young man shouting from the gate, "Mrs. Helen, Vivian has come back! She's carrying a little girl!" Before Annie could understand, memory that was not her own rushed into her like floodwater. This kitchen, that yard, the rain jar in the corner, the coarse brown blouse on her back, 2 rough hands split with husk ash and work. A name rose inside her, heavy as fate. Nguyen Chi Helen. The year was 1974, and outside the gate, Helen's daughter was coming home with a child the whole village would talk about all winter.
Chapter 1. The Straw Fire Wakes. Annie sat up too fast and nearly fell, catching herself on the bedpost. The hand gripping the wood was not hers anymore. It was leaner, rougher, hard at the knuckles like root and bark. The copper bracelet clung close around a darker wrist. Outside, the desperate voice called again, "Mother, open the door!" Something in that cry felt familiar enough to hurt, not because Annie recognized the speaker, but because another woman's pain had already begun to coil inside her. Anger, humiliation, fear for a child, and the stubborn pride of someone who had walked too long in bad weather to beg easily. Pieces of Helen's life flashed in fragments. A husband dead of fever in 1968. 3 children, a house that never had enough grain, a temper sharpened by grief and scarcity, love that gripped too hard until it bruised what it meant to protect. Annie crossed the earthen floor and slid the bolt aside. When the door opened, rain and cold rushed in together. A thin young woman stood on the threshold, her shoulders wrapped in a dark brown scarf soaked through. Wet hair clung to her cheeks. In her arms she held a child of about 3, burning with fever and crying so hard her voice had broken into hoarse little gasps. Behind them lay a wall of white rain. The young woman lifted her face. It was Vivian. Not the grandmother Annie had known with silver hair and tea-stained hands, but Vivian at 20. Jaw set hard, black eyes bright with caution, mouth split at one corner where the skin had cracked open in the cold. She looked like an animal that had fought its way out of a snare and had not yet decided whether the open field ahead was freedom or another trap. "Mother," Vivian said, her voice raw, "please let me in." A boy of about 12 came running from inside, soot streaked across his face. He stared at Vivian, then at the child in her arms, stammering as if he could not trust what he was seeing. Behind him stood a tall, narrow-shouldered girl in her mid-teens, lips pressed tight under the eaves. Her eyes moved from Vivian to Annie with equal parts fear and aching hope. Theo and Daisy, Annie thought at once. Helen's memory lurched through her, the last quarrel with Vivian, the slap, the cruel sentence flung in fury. Then go and don't step back into this house. After that, Vivian had left with her husband to the coastal district. Now she had come back in the middle of a rainstorm, carrying a feverish little girl, wearing the face of someone who had run out of roads. Annie did not have time to think as herself. She simply reached for the child, felt the little body blazing against her arms, and stepped aside. "Come in," she said. Vivian froze. In her memory, her mother would have cursed first and asked questions later, or shut the door entirely. Instead, Annie repeated it more slowly, as if she were speaking to someone who no longer believed in doors opening. "Come in, my girl." The last words rose so naturally that Annie startled at them herself. Vivian stood motionless for one breath, then lowered her head and stepped inside. Daisy pulled a bamboo cot closer to the stove. Theo hurried to close the door against the wind. The small house filled at once with breathing, rain, and the ragged sounds of a feverish child. Annie took the girl near the straw stove. Heat from the embers breathed against the child's flushed face. She had soft, sparse hair, round cheeks, and a red string around her neck, worn almost white with use. The moment Annie laid her down, she clutched Annie's sleeve with the blind instinct of a child searching for the nearest safe edge of the world. Vivian sank to her knees on the floor, shivering more from exhaustion than from cold. "She started burning up this afternoon," Vivian said. "I walked from the ferry. She hasn't eaten." "What's her name?" Vivian glanced up again, as if testing whether something ordinary would now be followed by something cruel. "May. I named her May." May. Annie's mother. Even though she had known this from the notebook, the truth still dried her throat. The little girl whimpered. There was no thermometer, no bottled syrup, no neat modern comfort. Yet Helen's knowledge and Annie's own practical memory began fitting together. She asked Daisy for water, Theo for dry kindling, and told Vivian to wring out the child's wet clothes at once. They moved without argument, perhaps because Helen's voice had always been law in that house, and perhaps because terror leaves no room for discussion. Annie cooled May's body with warm cloths, mixed the old leaf remedy Helen knew for fever and cough, and stirred a thin millet porridge with mulberry leaves while the rain hammered outside. Vivian tried to help, but twice her hands shook so hard she spilled water on the floor. Annie did not scold her. That alone made the silence in the room turn strangely fragile. Late in the night, a man ducked under the eaves and called softly from outside. He was tall, spare, and carried a canvas satchel darkened by rain. "Felix is here," Theo whispered. Felix was the commune medic. Annie knew him from Helen's drifting memories before she remembered his face from the later pages of the notebook. He stepped in, wiped his feet carefully, and crouched beside the cot without wasting words. His eyes were steady, the kind that never seemed hurried, even when the world around them was. He touched May's forehead, listened to her breathing, checked her pupils in the light of the stove, and nodded once. "The fever is high, but her chest is still clear. Keep cooling her. Give this in small sips." He measured powder into a folded scrap of paper, then wrote instructions on the back of an old cement sack with Theo's pencil. When he finished, he looked at Annie, at Helen really, with the faint surprise of a man who expected chaos and found discipline instead. "If she starts shaking or struggles to breathe, send for me at once," he said. "Thank you," Annie answered. The whole kitchen seemed to pause. She realized only then that Helen must rarely have said such words aloud. Felix's eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. Then he gave a brief nod and left the way he had come, rain stitching silver lines behind him. Night settled deeper. Daisy fed the stove. Theo sat by the door, hugging his knees, pretending not to stare at Vivian and May every few breaths. After a few spoonfuls of medicine, May drifted into exhausted sleep, still holding Annie's sleeve. "I'll stay a few days," Vivian said at last, staring into the fire. "Once I find somewhere else, I'll go." "This is your home," Annie said. Vivian gave a brittle laugh. "Since when?" Annie had no answer she could safely explain. She could not tell Vivian that the woman sitting before her was not quite the mother who had once cut her with hard words. She could not say that she herself was a granddaughter from half a century away, clinging to borrowed time beside a straw stove. So she gave the only answer that felt true. "Since the moment I opened the door." Vivian looked away sharply. She had not cried all evening. Perhaps she had spent her tears on the muddy road and the bitter ferry crossing, but at those words something in her face cracked. Her shoulders shook once, quickly, and stilled again. Annie did not sleep. She sat against a pillar and listened to rain ticking on the thatch, May's uneven breathing, Theo turning in uneasy half-dreams, Daisy grinding his teeth in sleep, Daisy waking to change the cloth on the child's head and moving barefoot through the room like a thin, determined shadow. In the quiet, Helen's memories kept flowing into Annie layer by layer, the taste of millet in hungry years, the drag of water buckets across slippery dikes, the panic of not having enough rice for 3 children, the way long years of surviving can make tenderness feel like a luxury item bought by luckier people. Toward dawn, May's fever broke. The little girl opened her eyes, stared at the dim ceiling, then turned to Annie and whispered in a cracked, sleepy voice, "Grandma." It was only one word, but it landed inside Annie's chest like a coal still hot in the ash. In the future, May had not yet lived. She would become Annie's mother. Here, for now, she was only a child who had come through one hard night and needed a hand to hold before she could trust sleep again. Annie took that hand. Outside, the rain had eased. A pale stripe of dawn was beginning to lift behind the bamboo hedge. The first day of winter in 1974 began that way. Chapter 2. The Woman the Whole Village Feared. By mid-morning, Annie understood that memory and reality were not the same thing. Helen's memories told her where every basket and jar stood, which firewood smoked least, which stretch of path to the cooperative yard hid holes under the mud. But Annie's mind still reeled at the blunt weight of life here. At first light, Daisy had swept the yard. Theo had carried buckets to the communal well. Vivian sat near the cot with bruised shadows under her eyes. May slept on after the fever, cheeks less red now. Annie lifted the lid off the grain jar and went still. There was less rice than she had imagined, enough for only a few careful meals. The rest was cracked corn, dried sweet potato, a little sorghum, 2 small bundles of dried fish hanging from the rafters, and a bag of shriveled peanuts. In Annie's own time, being poor often meant cutting luxuries, delaying rent, postponing some purchase. Here, poverty asked a simpler and crueler question. What do we cook today so nobody faints before noon? She washed a small handful of rice with the sorghum, added enough water to turn it into a thin porridge, and steamed slices of sweet potato above it to sweeten the broth. Smoke stung her eyes, yet Helen's hands knew their work. They knew how to twist dry straw for quick flame, how to set the bricks so the pot sat steady, how to wait without wasting heat. Sitting there in the dim kitchen, Annie found an odd calm. Some daily labors were so repetitive, so total, that they left the heart no room for panic. Vivian came to help without speaking. She washed pennywort gathered by the pond and shredded it fine for May's porridge. Her movements were quick and efficient, the movements of someone used to managing alone and expecting nothing from anyone. A dark bruise showed at her wrist below her sleeve. Annie wanted to ask about the husband named Tate, but she knew it was too early. Some wounds had only just skinned over. Touch them too soon, and they opened again. Breakfast was thick with awkwardness. Theo kept stealing glances at his sister and at May. Daisy quietly transferred the softest slices of sweet potato into May's bowl. Vivian fed her daughter one spoonful at a time. May leaned against her mother's chest and swallowed obediently, still too tired to speak much. "Are you staying for good?" Theo asked at last, trying for casual and failing. Vivian stopped. "I don't know yet." "Stay," Daisy blurted, then reddened. "The house still has room." "A house can have room. Whether the people in it want you there is another matter." The words were aimed squarely at Annie. Annie blew across a spoonful of porridge and set it in May's bowl. "Decide after you get your strength back. For now, eat." Silence fell again. Nobody in that room was used to hearing Helen speak without a hook hidden in the sentence. At the cooperative yard, Annie learned exactly why Helen had been the woman the whole village feared. Before she even reached the gate, eyes swept over her. Molly, wife of Deputy Chairman Bowen, stood by the communal well with a smile sweet as overripe cane. Two other women washing greens lifted their heads, too. The mud from last night's rain still clung to the yard, but gossip spread faster than water. Vivian came back, with a little girl, too. People say her husband threw her out. Or maybe she ran. That house was never peaceful anyway. Helen's old instinct would have been to silence them with one hard stare. Annie felt that temper stir in her bones, but she held it in check. Molly sang out in a falsely warm tone, "Sister Helen, I hear you took your daughter back in. How good of you. But with another mouth to feed, this month's grain allocation may need reviewing. And the child, does she have papers? In times like these, everything must be proper." There it was, a knife wrapped in sugar. Annie understood at once. A missing name in the household register, a child without documentation, a temporary arrangement never made official. Any of these could become a lever. Molly was not merely curious, she was marking a weak point. "Thank you for your concern," Annie said evenly. "My family's papers are mine to handle. Spare yourself the trouble." Molly blinked, thrown off balance by the quiet answer. After the work assignment meeting, Bowen called Annie aside. He was a large man with a practiced smile and fish-sharp eyes, the kind of man who made everyone lower their voice when speaking his name. Officially, he helped manage the warehouse and labor quotas. In practice, he kept his thumb on people's sore spots. "I heard about your daughter," he said. "Sad business, but rules are rules. People leave, people come back, strangers enter households. Grain, cloth, labor shares, all must be reported. Otherwise, I can't help you." "Then don't help me," Annie said. He chuckled. "No need to be stiff. Ah, and that vegetable patch behind your house. The cooperative is thinking of expanding the fertilizer shed. If you yield it, I could make several things easier for your family." Annie met his gaze. "That patch feeds my family. If the warehouse needs more room, expand yours somewhere else." Bowen smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "You should think it over. These days, people who bend live more easily." "People who bend too much eventually stop being people," Annie said. The men nearby went quiet. Bowen laughed loudly, pretending the exchange was a joke, but the look he left behind was cold. That afternoon, Daisy slipped something from beneath Helen's pillow and handed it to Annie. It was a bundle of old letters and a folded receipt. "I found these long ago," she whispered. "Mother used to hide them there. I never dared ask." Annie held them as if she were touching a secret organ of the house itself. A life does not become harsh in a single day, she thought. Sometimes it begins long before the daughter returns with a child. Sometimes it begins with letters hidden under a pillow, the nearest place to the heart and the hardest place to confess. Before she could open them, a young man in a worker's jacket stopped at the gate, clutching a school notebook. Daisy, coming back from the lane, changed color the instant she saw him.
"Why are you here?" she asked. His name was Henry. Helen's memory offered it up at once, an apprentice at the county radio repair station, often helping with evening literacy classes. Daisy loved learning, loved the world beyond the village hedge, and loved it with the hunger of someone who suspected it might be taken away if she wanted it too openly. Old Helen had always said too much education only made a girl harder to marry. Henry held out the notebook with both hands. "I copied the lesson for Daisy, and next week the county school is reviewing a few more spots for radio and electrical training. I think she should try." Daisy's eyes flashed with hope so bright Annie almost hurt from it. She understood then that this house held more than one fracture. Daisy, too, was standing at the lip of a life that could tip the wrong way with one push. "Leave the notebook on the table," Annie said. "Thank you." Henry stared. Daisy stared harder. "Mother?" Daisy whispered after he left. "What? What's wrong with you?" Annie almost laughed. "Would you prefer I shout?" Daisy shook her head fast, hugging the notebook to her chest, as if afraid the permission might evaporate. At dusk, Annie carried a padded jacket to Vivian by the back well. Vivian did not take it right away. "Wear it," Annie said. "The nights are colder here than by the coast. And tomorrow you'll say I'm living off you." "No." Vivian stared. "Then what is this?" Annie chose honesty. "Something I should have done long ago." A strange look crossed Vivian's face. Not trust, not yet, but the shock of a person who has been braced for the blow and instead finds an open hand. That night Annie opened the first of the hidden letters. The final page held a line written in haste by Luna, Helen's younger sister. "If this reaches you, I may already have made it past the evacuation point by the sea. I am sending the child's name in the wrapped paper. If I do not return, do not let the boy grow up as if he has no place in the world. There are things I cannot write in full. Please trust me once." At the bottom, one name had been written and crossed out. Tam. Beneath it, in a hand that must have been shaking, another name had been written instead. Theo. Chapter 3. The Letters Beneath the Pillow. Annie read Luna's letters over 3 nights, never able to bear more than a little at a time. The early ones came from evacuation stations, a field clinic, a coastal zone whose name Luna did not dare write. Her handwriting was fine and bright. Through those lines another woman emerged, Helen's younger sister, quick to laugh, clever with books, the one who had always wanted a wider life until war tore her out of the village like a leaf in floodwater. In the 4th letter, the truth broke open. "I am sending the boy ahead. If papers must be made, write him as your son. I know it is shameless to ask you to carry this in my place, but I have nowhere else left to turn. People are looking for those who traveled with me. If he stays near me, he will not be safe. If I live, I will return for him. If I do not, please do not let him be called a child with no standing." Theo was not Helen's youngest son by blood. He was Luna's child, hidden under Helen's roof to protect him, raised under the only name that would keep him safe. Annie sat with the lamp shaking at the edge of her vision. Theo, quiet and stubborn, who filled the rain jars before anyone asked and always gave May the larger piece of sweet potato, had grown up inside this house on a borrowed truth. So Helen had not only hidden anger, she had hidden sacrifice. She had used the authority of her own life to shelter at least one child.
The revelation did not excuse every hard thing she had done, but it cracked open a door Annie had not seen before. The next morning, Annie carried a basin of hot betel leaf water and salt to the back of the house where Vivian was washing clothes. She set it down beside her. "Put your hands in." Vivian looked at the steam. "I can take care of myself." "I know. Do it anyway." After a long pause, Vivian lowered her hands into the basin. The skin along one wrist was bruised purple-yellow. Annie sat on her heels beside her. "When did you leave?" Vivian kept her eyes on the water. 3 nights ago." Had it been bad for long? For the first time, Vivian did not snap back. "Not at first. When we first married, he was decent enough. He brought May a little rattle from the market once. Then some men drew him into moving contraband at night, then gambling, then debt. After that, he began to look at me and at the child the way desperate people look at objects they can trade." She swallowed. "The night I left, he wanted the earrings you gave me for my wedding. May hit her head when the cot overturned. I took her and ran." Annie kept her breathing even. Community-safe language was not a phrase that existed in 1974, but she still found herself reaching for gentler words, as if language itself could spare Vivian one more bruise. Leaving was the right thing.
Vivian gave a hard little laugh. Everyone else will call it shameful. Then let them be wrong. Vivian looked up sharply. Annie held her gaze. "There is no shame in walking away from a place that keeps hurting you." The words settled between them like something both fragile and unbelievable. After a while, Vivian asked, very quietly, "Who taught you to say things like that?" "Life," Annie answered. Vivian almost smiled. "Life taught you late. Late is still better than never." May recovered quickly after the fever broke. She began trailing Daisy into the garden, trailing Theo to the yard, but she followed Annie most of all. Each time she woke, she blinked around for Grandma, then hurried after the brown blouse and copper bracelet with sleepy devotion. At first the word struck Annie like an electric current because time itself seemed layered inside it. Then it became as natural as stove smoke. One afternoon, while Annie was cleaning tiny river crabs for soup, May sat beside her and asked, "Will our house throw me away?" The question was so light and so deadly that everything in the yard paused. Vivian stopped sewing. Theo froze with the hatchet in his hands. Daisy turned her face away. Annie set the bowl aside and drew the little girl into her lap. "No, our house will not throw you away." "Then why did Daddy send us out?" "Because some grown people become smaller inside than children," Annie said carefully. "That is their failing, not yours." May seemed to accept this the way children accept the weather, not fully understanding, but relieved to have a hand over her head. A few days later, Bowen's wife came circling again, this time through other women, through remarks dropped near the market and the well. Daisy heard enough to come home white-faced. "They're saying I should marry Bowen's son," she said, standing rigid in the doorway. "They say it would settle things. Vivian's papers, Theo's name, everything." Annie felt Helen's old rage flare hot in her ribs. She let the heat rise, but she shaped it instead of throwing it. "No one in this house is going to be traded for peace," she said. That same week, Annie made the trip to the district office under the excuse of clarifying household paperwork. There she met Ben, a clerk in the civil registry office with tired eyes and an unexpectedly gentle manner. Once he learned the names involved, he glanced at her for a long moment and lowered his voice. "I knew of this case. Not officially. Your sister's file was never finished because of the chaos after the war. If you still have her letters and any witness statements, we may be able to legalize the adoption record retroactively, not quickly, but properly." Annie returned with a small stack of forms and a larger sense of direction. For the first time since arriving in 1974, she understood that protecting this family would require more than warmth in the kitchen. It would require names written where names mattered. That night, as she sorted Luna's letters by candlelight, Felix stopped by under the pretense of checking May's cough. He looked at the papers on the table, then at Annie. "You've changed," he said. Annie kept her face still. "Is that bad?" "Not necessarily." He paused. "Sometimes people survive one season and speak differently after it." She nearly asked him whether he had already guessed the impossible. Instead, she folded the letters more neatly and said, "Then perhaps I am surviving one season." Felix's eyes held hers for a brief, unreadable moment. He did not press further. Annie was grateful for that. Some kindnesses arrive in the form of silence.
Chapter 4. The Rising Water. Winter deepened in waves. The northeast wind came long and damp, sunlight rare and muddy ground constant. In weather like that, staying alive was work from morning until sleep. Yet in the repetition of that work, Helen's house began to change. Annie sifted stove ash and dried it to keep moisture from the grain jar. She dried young guava leaves and brewed them for May when the child started to cough. She remembered practical tricks picked up in later years while filming in villages, salting strips of radish for storage, fermenting greens with rice water, drying sweet potatoes above charcoal so mold would not take them. None of it turned the house into a miracle. It simply made each meal a little less uncertain. Daisy became the most eager helper of all. Clever and quick-eyed, she needed to be shown only once. By evening, she sat under the oil lamp studying from the notebooks Henry brought. Sometimes she murmured to herself about waves, current, and radios that could catch voices from many kilometers away. Her face took on a strange, bright seriousness then, as if a second life were slowly being lit inside her. Theo, meanwhile, remained watchful. He still did his chores before anyone asked. He still spoke little, but he no longer flinched whenever Annie entered the room. One afternoon he came home wet to the thighs after helping shore up a dike beyond the fields. Annie saw the scrape on his palm and pulled him under the eaves. "That hurts," she said. "No, it doesn't." "Liar." He looked down, then muttered, "A little." "You don't have to prove you're strong every minute." He kicked at the threshold. "I hate that the whole village talks because Vivian came back." "So do I. But I'd hate it more if she had to leave again." Annie wrapped his hand in a strip of clean cloth. "Then we don't let other people choose our lives for us." He did not answer, but his shoulders loosened. A week later, unusually high water came in from the tide channels after a hard night of rain. The path to the cooperative yard turned slick as soap. Several sacks in the grain store were dragged out to dry, and Annie noticed what others had noticed only in passing: 2 types of sacks, 2 kinds of grain. The bags handed to ordinary households were damp and musty. Better rice, drier and cleaner, sat farther inside. She asked the question aloud in front of everyone. "Why are there 2 kinds of sacks in the warehouse?" Bowen's face hardened. "Are you trying to stir up trouble?" "No," Annie said. "I'm asking why the cooperative's grain seems to have 2 faces." Several heads turned. No one spoke, but the silence around the question was louder than any accusation. Bowen barked at the workers and had the inner room shut. That evening, Felix stopped by with more medicine for May and stayed to speak in a low voice near the porch. "You should be careful," he said. "Bowen doesn't like people touching what he thinks is his." Annie looked out at rain threading past the eaves. "Then perhaps he shouldn't keep his hand in everyone else's bowl." Felix almost smiled. "You really have changed." "Is change such a terrible thing?" "Only to those who benefit from things staying broken." He hesitated, then added, "You don't have to carry all of this alone." The words lingered after he left. That same night, Annie opened another of Luna's letters. This one described the old affection between the sisters before hardship had stiffened Helen into someone others feared. "My sister was never born sharp," Luna had written. "She became sharp the way a hoe becomes sharp, by striking the same ground too many years in a row." Annie sat with the sentence a long time. In the days that followed, she began gathering what people knew. Mr. Harold spoke of receiving moldy grain. Mrs. Sarah mentioned seeing stronger sacks moved to the locked inner room before the flood. Henry, who had been repairing the loudspeaker near the yard, had seen men carrying dry bags after dark. None of this was proof yet, but it was a shape. At home, the family now moved with a new rhythm. Vivian took in basket weaving and net mending. Daisy studied. Theo learned to fix little things under Henry's guidance when he came by. May laughed more, slept without waking in terror, and considered Annie's lap the safest place in creation. One evening, the four of them sat under the porch lamp while Henry explained simple circuits. Daisy listened so intently that she forgot to be shy. Theo leaned in, pretending not to care. May dozed with her cheek against Annie's shoulder. Annie looked at them and thought, perhaps memory is built from evenings like this, nothing grand, just the sound of study mixing with crickets, while cold air loses its bite because the people inside the house no longer freeze each other. And yet beneath that quiet, pressure was building. Bowen was not the kind of man to lose control gracefully. Annie knew the next move would come soon.
Chapter 5. In Search of a Name. After the flood, the village hummed for days. People whispered about the warehouse, the musty grain, the better sacks stored deeper inside. It was not yet a public scandal, but it had knocked some of the ease out of Bowen's manner. In return, Helen's household came under sharper scrutiny. Molly passed the gate loudly enough for everyone to hear, sighing over how some families found the energy to meddle in cooperative affairs while their own houses were not even in order. Children were pulled away from Daisy in the lane. Even women who had always liked her no longer lingered near the gate for fear of being seen. Then Bowen came in person. He did not arrive with false gifts this time. He walked to the center of the yard holding a crumpled paper and called for Annie as if summoning someone beneath him. "There is still the matter of the boy's name," he said, "and your returned daughter, and that little girl. Regulations are regulations, but I am not unreasonable. My son needs a wife. Your Daisy needs security. A marriage would make all these small difficulties disappear." Daisy had been washing vegetables under the eaves. Annie saw the bowl slip in her hands and roll across the bricks. "No," Annie said. Bowen widened his eyes in counterfeit patience. "Think carefully. You have a daughter who came back from a failed marriage, a child with uncertain papers, and a boy whose name does not sit cleanly in the household record. These are dangerous times for untidy stories. Then keep your son away from my gate and your mouth away from my daughters." Bowen's expression thinned. "You speak as if pride can fill a rice jar. And you speak as if every hungry house should hand over a girl to buy peace." He left with the crumpled paper still in his fist, but the threat stayed behind like smoke. The next morning, Annie took Vivian with her to the county office. The road was long and ugly with winter mud. May stayed with Sarah. Daisy, pale but determined, pressed Luna's letters into Annie's hands before she left. Ben met them in the registry office. His desk was stacked with folders and chipped enamel cups. He read the letters carefully, then looked from Annie to Vivian. "If witnesses confirm that the boy was taken in during wartime and raised continuously in this household, there is a legal path," he said. "It will not be elegant, but it can be done."
Vivian had been silent the entire journey. Now she spoke. "And my daughter, May?" Ben nodded slowly. "For her, we need the father's information, if it exists. If not, we record what can be verified and protect the child's status through the mother's household. The important thing is that she has a name on paper. A life should not be left hanging because adults failed each other."
Something in Vivian's face shifted. She had carried May all the way back through rain and shame and fear. Hearing a stranger speak of the child as a life worth protecting seemed to steady her spine. On the way home, they stopped by the roadside and ate cold sweet potatoes from a cloth bundle. For a while, neither said anything. Then Vivian asked, "Why are you doing all this?" Annie looked out over the fields where low winter light lay silver across the water. "Because home should not be the place that asks you to prove you deserve it." Vivian swallowed. After a long silence, she said, "When I was young, I thought you hated smoke because you hated us in it. Lately, I wonder if you hated the smoke because you were always too tired." Annie smiled faintly. Perhaps both once. It was the nearest thing to shared understanding they had reached yet. Back in the village, Henry brought Daisy practice questions for the county technical training exam. Theo sat beside them, pretending only to sharpen pencils, but he listened to every answer. Annie noticed Felix at the gate more often as well, sometimes with medicine, sometimes with news, sometimes with no excuse better than concern. There was no hurried heat in his manner. He simply stood where he said he would stand, a steady presence, like a tree that had survived enough storms to know when not to sway. One evening, after dropping off more witness statements for the paperwork, he lingered near the porch. "You are living as if time is short," he said quietly. Annie felt the copper bracelet cool against her skin. Maybe it is. Felix looked at the dark yard. Then use it well. Those words stayed with her. So did the way he did not demand explanation. At home, Annie began writing in the brown notebook between recipes, not just instructions for preserving food and easing children's fevers, but sentences no recipe could hold. Do not wear silence so long that your own children begin to mistake you for a wall. A daughter is not born to purchase peace for her parents. A child protected by a promise is still family. She did not know who would one day read those lines. She only knew that words, if chosen with care, might build the bridge speech had failed to build across 3 generations. Chapter 6. The Night of the Village Meeting. After the county trip, Annie stopped thinking only about endurance. If she kept ducking Bowen, he would keep probing until he found the weakest board in the house and split it. If she wanted peace, she would first have to cut away the hand that kept reaching into other people's kitchens. Fortunately for her, the matter of the warehouse had not settled. Harold complained openly now about moldy grain. Sarah did the same. A few others followed. Felix quietly helped Annie sort dates, sacks, and names into something closer to evidence. Henry, though young, agreed to say what he had seen the night before the flood. Daisy, shaken but brave, said she would speak too if needed. The village meeting was called for a dry afternoon after several days of damp fog. Bamboo benches were set in rows in the cooperative yard. Bowen sat at the front table with the chairman, the accountant, and several team leaders. Molly, powdered and sharp as if attending a performance, took a place in the front row. People clustered in little knots, whispering with bright eyes. Annie arrived with Vivian, Daisy, and Theo. May stayed with Sarah. Felix stood at the edge of the yard holding a paper packet. Henry hovered near the loudspeaker pole. The whole scene felt like a stage built from mud and cold breath. The meeting began with the usual talk of collective spirit.
Then Bowen, unable to help himself, steered toward accusation. "Recently, there have been malicious rumors that harm solidarity," he said. "If anyone has complaints about the warehouse, speak openly. Do not poison the village with talk behind backs." Harold stood first. He described the moldy sacks his family had received. Sarah followed, then others. Bowen smiled thinly and blamed high water, confusion, clerical mistakes. The room pulled one way, then another. At last, Annie stood. She placed on the table several scraps of sack seal, a small notebook, and a list of witness statements. The bags distributed to households carried different markings from the dry bags moved into the locked inner room, she said. The deliveries to my house and Mr. Harold's were only hours apart, yet the grain quality and the seals do not match. If necessary, compare them against the inventory book. Felix stepped forward and added signed notes from several households. Henry, red-faced but steady, said he had seen men carrying clean sacks into the back room before the tidewater rose. Murmurs spread through the yard. Bowen's face darkened. "What do children know of serious matters?" "Only what they saw," Henry answered. Molly sprang up. "This household keeps dragging outsiders in to bite the hand that feeds the village." That was when Daisy stood. She was trembling so badly her hands had gone white, but her eyes were bright and clear. "If you call them outsiders, then first tell your husband to stop trying to trade me for paperwork." The whole yard went silent. Bowen slammed a hand on the table. "Mind your tongue." Daisy swallowed hard and went on. "He came to our house twice. He wanted the back garden. He wanted me to marry his son. He said it would settle the papers for my sister Vivian and my brother Theo. We are poor, yes, but not poor enough to exchange a person for convenience."
A shock went through the crowd like cold water. Bowen's son, seated at the back, lowered his head in shame. Molly began protesting, but her voice no longer carried conviction. Then Bowen made his mistake. He yanked an old receipt from his pocket like a final weapon. "And what of the boy's papers?" he snapped. "Helen herself wrote false information years ago. You think that will save you?" Theo, seated beside Annie, went pale but did not bow his head. Annie laid Ben's prepared folder on the table. "No, truth will save him." At that moment, Ben himself appeared at the edge of the yard with a young commune officer and crossed into the crowd. He confirmed what the letter showed. Luna had sent her child home during the war. Helen had raised him to protect him. The temporary paperwork had never been completed in the chaos afterward, but the case qualified for legal recognition as a wartime adoption. The officer, after reviewing the file, stated clearly that the matter could be regularized and could not be used to coerce or humiliate the family. The current in the yard changed at once. Whispers swerved toward Bowen. Annie looked straight at him. "A child's name is not a rope for you to pull," she said. "A daughter's future is not grain to be measured on your scale." Bowen opened his mouth but found no words. The chairman turned on him then, demanding the warehouse books be surrendered for inspection the next day. Sarah's voice rang out from the benches. "Enough!" Others took courage from that single word. No one pulled Bowen from power on the spot, but the chair beneath him had cracked. In the middle of the commotion, Vivian stood up. She did not cry. She did not shake. "I left my husband because staying would have broken me and my child," she said. "Anyone who wants to call that shame may do it to my face. I will still say the same thing tomorrow." Several women dropped their eyes. Others looked at her with something softer than judgment for the first time.
The truth she spoke belonged to more than one household. The meeting broke apart in waves. Bowen was ordered to hand over the warehouse book. Molly dragged him home with a face drained white. Daisy stood bent over as if she had run across a whole field. Theo touched Annie's hand once, very lightly. That single touch told her something inside him had begun, at last, to mend. When the yard finally emptied, Felix came to stand beside her. "You did it," he said. Annie looked up at a sky where the first thin stars had appeared after weeks of cloud. "There were days I thought surviving this one season would be enough." "And now?" Felix asked. She listened to the wind moving over the yard. "Now, I think survival is only the beginning." Chapter 7. An Apology Beneath the Thatch Roof. After the village meeting, the wind changed direction. Not everything became easy overnight, but people looked at Helen's Gate differently. Molly no longer stationed herself at the lane mouth to fire sly remarks. Bowen was forced to submit the warehouse to inspection, and his authority sagged like a rotting fence. More important than any of that, voices within the house itself began to soften. Theo took several days to settle after learning the truth about Luna. At first, he disappeared whenever her name came up. Twice, Annie found him sitting alone on the porch roof after dark, knees drawn up, staring across the lane. She did not pull him down. Some truths must sit beside a person for a while before they can be touched. On the third night, he slipped into her room and sat by the cot. "Do you remember my mother?" he asked. Annie closed her eyes and gathered what Helen's memories still held. Luna singing while washing rice. Luna bringing Daisy some tiny ribbon from the market, no matter how little money she had. Luna speaking boldly, while secretly fearing thunder. Annie told Theo all of it, not as a saint's portrait, but as a living woman assembled from bright small details. He listened as if collecting pieces of a face he had been denied his whole life. "Who do I look like?" he asked at last. "Most of all, you look like yourself," Annie said. "But if I have to say it, you carry Luna's heart. You care for people before you know how to speak it." "Do you still love me?" The question came so softly she almost missed it. "I am loving you right now," Annie said. Theo lowered his head against her shoulder. The first time in years he had leaned on his mother like a child instead of a small old man. The gesture was tiny, but Annie felt forgiveness learning how to walk. Daisy seized her chance with both hands. Henry brought the notice for the county radio and electrical training class. Daisy held the paper so tightly it trembled. "You really mean I may try?" she asked. "You may try," Annie said. "And if you fail, you may try again." That night, Daisy laughed out loud under the porch lamp for the first time Annie had heard. Henry grinned back at her with his ears turning red. Vivian, mending nets beside them, quietly solved arithmetic with her whenever the lessons turned difficult. May fell asleep in Annie's lap, listening to the distant hiss of a radio Henry was repairing. Annie watched the scene and thought that years later, all of them would probably remember evenings like these more vividly than any victory at the cooperative yard. Vivian, too, began to come back to herself. She borrowed bamboo frames from Sarah and took in basket weaving and net repairs. The hands that had trembled while clutching May in the rain grew steady again. When women from another hamlet dropped pointed comments about her husband, she no longer lowered her head. She answered clearly and kept walking. One mild afternoon near the end of the month, Vivian and Annie sat together sorting greens in a stripe of rare sunlight. "When I was little," Vivian said, "I hated the smell of stove smoke." "Why?"
because every time you lit the stove, you seemed ready to scold someone. I thought the kitchen turned you into another person." Annie let the words settle. Vivian twisted a stalk between her fingers. "Later, when I married and life became what it became, there were nights I sat by another family's stove and understood that maybe you did not hate the smoke. Maybe you were only very tired." "I was," Annie said, "and I did harm because of that." Vivian turned to her, eyes straight and clear. "I know, but I don't feel what I felt before anymore. I don't know if that's forgiveness or just being too tired myself to keep carrying the old anger." "Either one is enough to start with," Annie said. Vivian laughed softly. "You say thank you and sorry a lot these days. It still sounds strange." That night, Felix came by with fever medicine for May and lingered on the porch. Moonlight lay thin over the yard. "Do you ever feel," he asked, "that you're living on borrowed time?" Annie startled. "Why would you say that?" "Because some people return from war that way. They live as if life has been loaned back to them, and they have to use every day before someone asks for it again. Lately, when I look at you, I think of that." The copper bracelet was cool against her wrist. Annie could not tell whether to laugh or to be afraid. At last she said, half truthfully, "Maybe I am living on borrowed time." Felix looked out toward the areca palms. "Then perhaps you should not waste it on silence." He left soon after, but his words remained. The next morning, Annie wrote more lines into the brown notebook between recipes and remedies. "Do not use silence as armor so long that the people who love you begin to think you are made of wall. Girls do not grow up to be bargaining chips. Children held by promise are still blood of the heart." Near New Year's Day, Daisy received word that she had been accepted into the training program. The entire house lit up. Henry brought a tiny packet of peanut candy in celebration. Theo thumped her shoulder with mock seriousness. Vivian spent her hoarded coins on a second-hand fountain pen from the district market. May did not understand what vocational study meant, but because everyone else was smiling, she bounced and smiled too. That evening, they ate chicken porridge from a bird Felix had treated and later given them. Meat was rare enough to feel ceremonial. Scallion, ginger, and stove smoke braided into a smell so warm it almost broke Annie's heart. Daisy read her acceptance notice again and again, as if dawn might erase it. Vivian looked at her siblings, then at May, then at Annie. "I think this is the first meal we've eaten in a long time without swallowing tears with it," she said. Annie looked at the steam rising from the pot in the middle of the tray and felt her throat tighten. Happiness, she thought, is not always bright. Sometimes it is simply a meal in which nobody needs to brace themselves before speaking. Late that night, an odd, dry wind began to circle the yard, searching old paths. Annie was closing the notebook when the copper bracelet suddenly grew warm against her skin. She went very still. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the faint tug of a voice calling from very far away. Her season in this borrowed life was nearing its end. Chapter 8. When the kitchen smoke turns with the wind. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the bamboo screen in pale lines. May was in the yard singing nonsense to herself while spinning a battered little drum. The sound was clear as rainwater. Peace lay over the house so gently that Annie almost did not trust it. Vivian was spreading a woven mat to dry laundry. Theo sharpened pencils for Daisy, who was preparing to leave for the county training class, and handled every object as if it were treasure. May ran around Annie's legs, falling and laughing, rising again without complaint. The ordinary tenderness of the scene struck Annie so sharply that she wanted to memorize everything. the patched seam at the corner of the blanket, the crack in the grain jar, the smell of straw smoke in morning air, Vivian's fingers tying May's hair, Theo's grave instruction to Daisy not to trust people too easily once she reached the county. At noon, Felix came with cough medicine for May. When the others drifted into the kitchen, he remained under the porch with Annie. "I think you're about to leave," he said. Annie turned to him. "Why do you speak as if you know?" Felix smiled faintly. "Because people only look at the world that carefully when they know they must soon part from it." This time she did not deny it. "If I do go," she said, "come by this house sometimes." "Do you think I help because you ask?" "No, I think you help because that is the kind of man you are." He was quiet for a moment. "Once, years ago, I used to be angry with Helen. I saw the way she loved through fear and thought children were better off with no mother than with one like that." He lifted his gaze to Annie. "But these past months, I keep thinking that every person has a threshold of pain. Once they live beyond it long enough, even ordinary kindness becomes difficult." Annie smiled gently. "That is not the worst judgment I have ever received. No, and perhaps not the final one either." That afternoon, Annie called the family together in the main room. The brown notebook lay on the table. Luna's letters were beside it. "I want to say a few things while my heart is clear," she began. Daisy looked frightened at once. "Are you ill?" "No, but some words should be spoken before they are needed." Vivian sat with May in her lap. Theo folded himself cross-legged on the floor. The winter light rested thin and silver on every face Annie loved. She looked at Vivian first. "You never need to prove that you deserve a home. Home is where you are allowed to remain when you are weakest. If anyone treats you cruelly again, turn your back on the cruelty before you turn your back on yourself." Vivian bit her lip and nodded through tears. To Daisy, she said, "Learn as far as your mind wants to go. A girl's future does not shrink just because a village is small." To Theo, "A name on paper matters, but the love that raised you matters too. Hold both. Do not let anyone make you ashamed of either." To little May, who only understood half of anything and all of love, she said, "Grow up warm. Even if life gets cold, do not become cold with it." May leaned forward and kissed Annie's cheek as if that settled the matter. The wind rose toward evening. Annie sat alone beside the stove after the others slept, the notebook open in her lap. The bracelet burned now, not painfully but with certainty. Around her the old house breathed, bamboo screens sighing, embers clicking, someone turning in sleep beyond the partition. She laid her palm flat on the floorboards. "Take care of them for me," she whispered to the woman whose life she had borrowed. "I have done what I could." The answer was not a voice exactly, more like warmth moving through the house itself. Then the room darkened, the smell of straw smoke thickened, and the world folded. When Annie opened her eyes again, she was back in the modern kitchen behind Vivian's old house. The candle had burned to a stub. Rain pressed against the roof. Her mother was standing in the doorway, face pale. "Annie." Annie's throat closed. May, adult May, her mother, still held the old teacup in both hands. "Mom," Annie said, and the word came out broken. She did not try to explain time travel. She only crossed the room and held her mother the way people hold something both ordinary and irreplaceable. That night, for the first time after the funeral, mother and daughter lit the old wood stove in the back kitchen. Not a gas burner, not an electric cooker, the actual stove Vivian had once kept alive with straw and ash. May made crab soup from the recipe in the notebook. Annie steamed slices of sweet potato the way she remembered doing in 1974. Smoke curled through the old tiles and climbed into the dark. While they waited for the pot to boil, May said quietly, "Let's not sell the house yet." Annie looked up. "All right. And this new year, I want to stay here a few days, if you want to as well." "I do," Annie said. Their dinner was simple, but like another meal beneath another roof long ago, it was the first one in a very long time that nobody had to swallow with tears. A month later, Annie took extended leave from work. She stayed in Jiao Tui with May and repaired the kitchen roof, replaced rotten beams, cleaned every old ceramic jar. In a back room, they found one more faded black and white photograph. Helen seated in the middle, stern-faced but with gentler eyes than Annie would have expected. Beside her, a young Vivian holding toddler May. Daisy in a white blouse with a radio in her hands. Theo standing behind them with a tool bag slung across one shoulder. And at the edge of the frame, blurred but unmistakable, a tall, thin man, smiling very slightly. Felix. Annie held the photograph for a long time. Some people enter your life for only one season and remain with you forever. That spring, mother and daughter reopened the back kitchen as a small weekend eatery and named it "When the Kitchen Smoke Turns with the Wind." They did not advertise loudly. They cooked from the notebook instead. Millet porridge, crab soup, sweet potatoes steamed with dark sugar, shrimp paste dishes, simple food that carried memory like fragrance. Villagers came. Travelers from the coast stopped by. Some asked to photograph pages from the old notebook hanging in a frame on the wall. May, standing at the stove, no longer fell silent whenever Vivian's name came up. She told customers about her mother, about Aunt Daisy becoming the first woman in the area who knew how to repair radios, about Uncle Theo working later in civil registration and refusing to let anyone lose their name in paperwork, about home and winter and the long, stubborn work of coming back to one another. Sometimes Annie added a detail she could never explain fully, that little May had once loved a toy drum, that Vivian used to fear kitchen smoke, that Theo sat on the porch roof whenever grief became too large to hold at ground level. May would glance at her in surprise, and then only smile, as if accepting that among the women of their family there were roads connecting one heart to another that logic did not need to map. The notebook was wrapped in protective film and kept in the highest cabinet. On its last page, beside Helen's line and Annie's notes, Annie added one sentence of her own. "A home is not a place that never breaks. It is the place where people learn to gather one another up after breaking." On Lunar New Year's Eve, while sticky rice cakes boiled in the yard and stove smoke braided with the scent of dong leaves, May suddenly took Annie's hand. "Thank you for coming back," she said. Annie looked at her mother, then at the old roof glowing in firelight. Somewhere deep in memory and present time together, she could still hear a child in 1974 whispering, "Grandma, rain on thatch," and a weary woman writing that when smoke still rises, people still want to come home. She smiled and held her mother's hand tighter. The stove was warm. The house remained.
Hey there! If you enjoy our audio content, don't forget to hit that like button and share this video with your friends. Most importantly, click subscribe and ring the bell to stay updated with everything Zuzu Audio. Support the channel and join our community today.